For me, I always use my pinkies to stabilize myself when using a handheld. It's not something I would want to use to actually press a button. And so in that regard, I basically turned off these back buttons and didn't use them at all. And it's kind of a shame because I think if they were better placed, I would probably use them more often. Now let's take the opportunity to also talk about the back. Now obviously we have a large fan intake here on the left, and this does keep the device nice and cool under a heavy load. Also underneath the kickstand, we have a microSD card slot, which I think is great. I love having expanded storage. And this little sticker right here is actually covering where the 4G LTE module will go if you happen to buy that upgrade. Next, I want to talk about the kickstand itself, because I do appreciate the fact that we have a kickstand, and this really only extends to one specific length, and I found myself wishing that it was a little bit wider. For example, when I'm playing a large handheld like this in tabletop mode, I prefer to keep it at a wider angle. This allows me to rest my arms and wrists on the table itself, but then also have a nice angle for my face. And if we had a kickstand that would kind of hold it in place right here, I think it would enhance that experience. However, the kickstand here on the Gwiddly is in a much more upright position. And I think that'll work fine if you're using it in tabletop mode like this with an external controller. But the thing is, this has such nice controls right there on the device that I'd rather actually hold it at a lower angle and have it in handheld mode, but with that kickstand. So I think that's a minor gripe. I appreciate the fact that they have a kickstand, but I just wish it did have a little bit more angle to it. Another thing I found to be less than ideal with the design are these two function buttons here on the top left and right. The top left one will function as an Xbox button. This is something that I rarely actually will need, but it's taking up a prime space on this handheld. Same thing with the top right button. This actually just brings up your iSpace quick menu. It's the exact same thing that the bottom right button does as well. Now the fact that we have these two function buttons that are not very functional is not a really big concern for me. The thing that annoys me about it is their placement, because these would be perfect for start and select. Instead, they put those buttons on the bottom left. And I can't overstate how many times I accidentally pressed the function buttons because I thought they were start and select. So it's a relatively minor thing from a design standpoint, but it does take away from that ultimate experience for me. And finally, the last thing that surprised me as not being a very ultimate experience was the screen itself. There's a couple things at play right here. Number one is the fact that we have a very large screen, but as far as I can tell, it has zero anti-glare features. So when you're playing it in a brightly lit environment like here in my studio, it becomes basically a mirror in terms of reflection. This is something that other companies have recognized and taken measures to prevent. For example, the ROG Ally has an anti-glare coating to it, which I think works really well while still keeping it nice and crisp. And of course, the screen on the high-end version of the Steam Deck has that etched glass, which also is anti-reflective. Now, neither of these screens will prevent all reflections, but they are much easier to use in a brightly lit environment compared to the Gwiddly. And honestly, on its own, this is not a deal breaker for me, but the other thing that I didn't like about the screen was the actual quality of the brightness and colors. Now here I am at the lowest brightness possible, and you can see that the bright segments here are washed out. To me, this is an indication that they've configured the gamma on this to be too low. So what this means is that any sort of bright object that you can find on the screen will get washed out, both in terms of textures, but then also the color as well. And bear in mind, I'm using the absolute lowest brightness settings available on this device. And so yeah, I was pretty bummed out by this. You know, we have a very reflective screen that's kind of washed out, and these two factors really mar the fact that we have a nice big screen with a high resolution. And to top it off, if you try to make it any brighter, it'll get even more washed out. Now thankfully, there's not a huge range between the dimmest and brightest setting, which is also negative on its own, but at least it doesn't get super washed out. Either way, this is one of the first things I noticed when I picked up the Gwiddly that really took away from that ultimate experience. Now there are some benefits to having a much larger screen. For example, if you want to play real-time strategy games or something else that has very small characters, this 8.4-inch screen will help you out. For example, here I'm playing this game at a full 1600p scaling, and this essentially means we're playing the game at 1440p, but because it has an aspect ratio of 16:10, it's a little bit taller, and so that's where we get those 1600 vertical pixels. So in some regards, yes, the screen is very good, but there are other factors that keep it from being ultimate. Next, I want to talk about size and weight, and this isn't really a good or bad thing, but really just a showcase of what you're going to be getting into if you happen to pick up this device. And of course, I think that the people most interested in it are people who want to have that large screen experience. And this definitely provides that. For example, it is around the same size as the Steam Deck, maybe a little bit taller, but you can see that 8.4-inch screen is much larger than the Steam Deck's. It's the same thing with the ROG Ally. If you want something larger and more impressive, then yeah, I think the Gwiddly will fit that bill. Now the screen is slightly larger than other 8-inch devices like the AOK Zoe A1 Pro, but between the two I think I would prefer the Gwiddly just because we have those really excellent controls. The only other device I have that is comparably larger than the Gwiddly is this crazy TJD device that I reviewed a few weeks back. This one has a 10-inch screen and a litany of problems, so I don't really think it's worth